There's a gravestone in eastern Kentucky with two names on it, the same woman, listed twice, once as a wife, once as a granddaughter. And if you think that's a clerical error, you haven't been paying attention to what happens when isolation meets desperation, meets the kind of silence that gets passed down like silverware. This is the story of a family that didn't just bend the rules of bloodlines. They erased them, and what they created in the mountains of Appalachia wasn't just scandal. It was a biological loop that science can barely map, and psychology refuses to touch. Because when a family tree circles back on itself, when cousin becomes spouse, becomes parent, becomes cousin again, you don't get a family. You get a closed system, a genetic echo chamber, and the people trapped inside it. They always knew, the family we're examining today started like most American lineages: immigration, opportunity, the promise of land. They arrived in the 1820s, settling into the remote hollers of eastern Kentucky, where the mountains weren't just geographic features. They were wolves. The nearest town was a day's ride. The nearest law enforcement even farther. And in that isolation, in those valleys where fog hung so thick you could taste the mineral weight of it, a family began to grow in ways families were never meant to grow. By the 1840s, they had established a homestead, cleared land, built cabins, started the slow, grinding work of survival, and then the marriages began, not to neighboring families, not to newcomers passing through. To each other, first cousins, that was the beginning. Legal, even common in that era. But it didn't stop there. Because once you cross that line, once you accept that the gene pool can be this small and still function, the boundaries start to dissolve. Second marriages after deaths weren't to new families. They were to nieces, to cousins once removed. And then, in the case that would define this bloodline forever, an uncle married his brother's daughter. She was 16, he was 42, and the child they had, she would go on to marry her own grandfather's brother, creating a knot in the family tree so tight that genealogists still argue about how to chart it. Because this wasn't just inbreeding, this was something closer to biological recursion, a family that began to reference itself, to feed on its own genetic material like a closed loop of code that can't escape its own function. And the consequences, they didn't take long to show. By 1870, the family had produced 4 generations in the same valley, 43 documented members. And if you look at the census records, if you really study the names and the ages and the relationships listed in fading ink, you start to notice something, the repetition, not just of names, which was common enough, but of afflictions, stillbirths clustered in certain branches, children who survived but never spoke, a pattern of early deaths that officials attributed to fever, to accident, to the hardness of mountain life. But the family knew better. They had to. Because when your daughter is born with fingers fused together, when your son's eyes don't track right, when 3 babies in a row come out silent and blue, you don't need a geneticist to tell you something's gone wrong in the blood. There's a diary entry from 1873, written by a schoolteacher who visited the homestead. She was there to assess whether the children could attend a new school being built in the county. She wrote 4 pages. Only one survives water, damaged and kept in a historical society archive that doesn't advertise what it contains. She described a boy, age 7, who could not form words, but who watched her with what she called an ancient intelligence. A girl, age 10, who walked with a severe limp and whose jaw protruded in a way that made eating difficult, and a baby, less than a year old, who the mother held facing away from visitors. The teacher noted the mother's shame. Her refusal to turn the child around, and then, in the margin of the page, in handwriting that looks rushed, almost frantic, the teacher wrote, "They are all kin to each other in ways I cannot speak of. The father is brother to his wife's mother. I do not know how to report this. She never did." The school was built. None of the family's children attended, and the marriages continued, because here's what isolation does. It doesn't just limit your options, it normalizes the unthinkable. When you've only known 30 people your entire life, and 20 of them share your last name, the idea of marrying outside the family isn't just difficult, it's alien. It's a betrayal of the only social structure you've ever understood. And so the loop tightened. A man named Josiah married his first cousin in 1869. When she died in childbirth 3 years later, he married her younger sister, his second cousin. Their children married each other. A brother and sister from that union married a brother and sister from another branch. And the family tree, which should have looked like a tree, spreading outward, growing broader with each generation, instead began to look like a braid. Strands folding back into themselves, names appearing in multiple branches, the same blood circling back again and again with nowhere new to go, and the silence around it, that was the most American part of all. Because this wasn't hidden in the way you might think. There were no cover-ups, no falsified records. The county clerk wrote down exactly what was happening. Marriage licenses between first cousins, between uncles and nieces, once the law looked the other way or didn't look at all. The neighbors knew, the pastor knew, the doctor, when one finally came through in the 1880s, he knew too. He wrote in his ledger about congenital defects, about shortened lifespans, about children who didn't survive their first winter. But no one intervened, because intervention required one of two things. Either you believed these people were victims who needed saving, or you believed they were criminals who needed stopping. And America in the late 1800s didn't want to believe either. It was easier to let the mountains keep their secrets, to let certain families disappear into the fog and pretend they were choosing it. But they weren't disappearing, they were multiplying. By 1890, the family had spread across 3 adjacent valleys. 78 documented members, and the marriages had become so intertwined that a single child could trace their lineage back to the same ancestor through 4 different paths. Imagine that. Imagine your great-grandfather appearing in your family tree 8 separate times. Not because of record-keeping errors, but because your bloodline has folded over itself so many times that the same man is simultaneously your great-grandfather, your great-great-uncle, your second cousin twice removed, and your wife's grandfather. Geneticists have a term for this now, pedigree collapse, when your family tree has fewer ancestors than it should because the same people occupy multiple positions. In a healthy lineage, you should have 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents, but in this family, by the 4th generation, some members had only 3 unique great-grandparents. The rest were repeats, genetic echoes, and the effects were catastrophic. A study conducted in 1923, decades after the worst of it, examined the health outcomes of 26 family members who were still alive. 14 had significant physical disabilities, 11 showed signs of cognitive impairment. 7 were completely deaf. The rate of infant mortality in the family was 62%. More than half of children born didn't live to see their 5th birthday, and yet the marriages continued. Because by that point, what choice did they have? The damage was done. The gene pool was so compromised that even if they had wanted to marry outside the family, even if they had tried to introduce new blood, the traits were already locked in. Recessive genes that should have stayed buried were now dominant. Mutations that should have appeared once in 1,000 births were showing up in every other child. There's a photograph from 1910. It's kept in a private collection now, rarely displayed. It shows 11 members of the family standing in front of a cabin, 3 generations, and if you look closely, if you can get past the grainy quality and the formal poses, you can see it, the way certain features repeat. Not in the normal way families share traits, but in a way that feels wrong. The same distinctive jaw on a grandmother, her daughter, and her grandson. The same unusual ear shape on 4 people who shouldn't look that identical. And the eyes. Every single person in that photograph has the same eyes, not the color, the expression, a kind of hollow awareness, like they knew exactly what they were, and they were asking you not to look. The breaking point came in 1918, not because anyone outside the family finally intervened, but because the family itself began to collapse under the weight of what it had become. A woman named Martha, 23 years old, gave birth to her 4th child. The father was her mother's brother, which made him both her uncle and her children's father. The baby lived 6 days. In that time, Martha apparently experienced what the single existing medical record calls a complete mental break. She stopped speaking, stopped eating, and when her husband, her uncle, tried to comfort her, she attacked him with a kitchen knife, not fatally, but with enough force that the county sheriff was finally called to the homestead for the first time in the family's 90-year history. What the sheriff found was documented in a report that was sealed for 70 years. When it was finally opened in 1988, historians realized they were looking at something closer to an anthropological survey than a criminal investigation. The sheriff described a community of 41 people living in conditions he compared to medieval serfdom, multiple generations sharing single-room cabins, children who had never been more than 5 miles from where they were born, and a social structure so insular that he couldn't determine who had authority, who made decisions, or even who was married to whom. Everyone deferred to everyone else. Everyone claimed responsibility for nothing. And when he tried to arrest Martha for assault, 6 different people claimed to be her legal guardian: her father, who was also her grandfather, her husband, who was also her uncle, her brother, who was also her cousin. The sheriff left without making an arrest. He wrote in his report that he didn't believe the law, as he understood it, had any jurisdiction over what he had witnessed, but something had shifted. Maybe it was Martha's breakdown. Maybe it was the realization that outsiders were finally looking. Or maybe it was simply that the family had reached a biological threshold where continuation was no longer possible. Whatever the reason, the marriages slowed. Not stopped, but slowed. Between 1920 and 1940, only 8 marriages were recorded within the family, down from 23 in the previous 2 decades. Some members left. A few moved to nearby towns, changed their names, tried to build lives where their origins wouldn't follow them. Others stayed, but stopped having children. And the ones who did continue the pattern, who married their cousins and their nieces and their second cousins twice removed. They produced fewer and fewer surviving offspring. The gene pool wasn't just shallow anymore, it was toxic. By 1950, there were only 19 living members of the original family line. Most were over 50. Several were institutionalized. And the youngest, a girl named Sarah, was 16, unmarried, and according to social services reports, profoundly disabled. She was the last. When she died in 1974, childless and alone in a state facility, the family tree that had twisted back on itself for 150 years finally came to an end, but the records remained, the photographs remained. The gravestones with 2 names remained, and the question that no one wants to ask, the question that sits at the center of this story like a stone in dark water, remained too. How does this happen? How does an entire family, an entire community, look at what they're doing and choose to continue? The answer isn't as simple as ignorance. These weren't uneducated people stumbling blindly into genetic catastrophe. They could read, they kept records, they knew how to count generations. And by the 1880s, when the effects were undeniable, when every other child was born with something wrong, they had to know. But knowing and stopping are two different things, because stopping would have required them to admit what they had done, not just to outsiders, to themselves. It would have required them to look at their children, their siblings, their spouses, and acknowledge that the love they claimed, the families they built, were constructed on a foundation of biological violation. And that kind of admission doesn't just destroy a family, it destroys the concept of family itself. So they chose silence. They chose to frame it as tradition, as mountain custom, as the way things had always been done. They told themselves that outsiders didn't understand, that city people with their books and their science couldn't comprehend the bonds that held a real family together. And in that reframing, in that desperate self-justification, they turned themselves into a closed system. A biological echo chamber where the same genetic material circulated endlessly, degrading with each pass, like a photocopy of a photocopy, until the original image was unrecognizable. But they convinced themselves it was preservation. They convinced themselves they were keeping something pure. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have been the one to break the cycle? Or would the weight of 100 years of silence have kept you locked in place, just like them? The psychological toll of this arrangement is something modern researchers are only beginning to understand. There are interviews conducted in the 1960s with some of the last surviving members that were never published. Too disturbing, the researchers said, too ethically complex to present without context that didn't exist yet. In those interviews, you hear people describing childhoods where they didn't understand family roles, where a woman was simultaneously their mother and their cousin, where their father was also their grandfather's brother. One man, speaking in 1967, described realizing at age 12 that his wife, who he would marry 6 years later, was both his second cousin and his aunt. He said he remembered the exact moment he understood what that meant. He was standing in a field, the sun was setting, and he felt, in his words, like the ground under him wasn't ground anymore, like he was standing on something that only looked solid but would give way the moment he questioned it. That's what this family tree represents, not just a genetic anomaly, but a psychological labyrinth where identity itself becomes unstable, where you can't draw a straight line from yourself to your origins because every line doubles back. Every connection loops, and the person you are is less an individual and more a point where multiple lineages intersect and cancel each other out. They weren't a family. They were a system eating itself. And everyone trapped inside it knew there was no way out that didn't involve erasing everything they thought they were. In 2003, a geneticist from the University of Kentucky requested access to the family's medical records for a study on the long-term effects of sustained consanguinity. That's the clinical term, consanguinity, marriage between blood relatives. It sounds almost polite when you say it that way, sterile, but what she found in those records wasn't polite. It was a multi-generational cascade of genetic disorders so severe that she initially thought the records had been compiled from multiple unrelated families: hemophilia, albinism, cleft palates, skeletal dysplasia, polydactyly, microcephaly. Conditions that should appear randomly, sporadically, were showing up in clusters, in patterns. And when she mapped the family tree, when she traced the marriages and the births and the deaths across 5 generations, she found something that made her stop her research entirely. There was a single mutation. A recessive gene variant so rare that it appears in less than 1% of the general population. In this family, by the fourth generation, it was present in 93% of documented members, which meant that the same genetic error was being passed down, concentrated, amplified with each generation. But here's the part that made her stop: that mutation wasn't just rare. It was linked to a specific region in Europe, a small area in what is now Germany, where a similar pattern of intermarriage had occurred 300 years earlier, and the family that carried it there, they had died out by 1750, every single member. The gene pool had collapsed so completely that the lineage simply ended. What this geneticist had found, preserved in the mountains of Kentucky, was a genetic echo of a European extinction event, the same pattern, the same inevitable conclusion, just delayed by geography and isolation. She never published her findings. When asked why, in a private correspondence that was later leaked, she said she couldn't figure out how to write it without making the family members sound like lab specimens, like data points in a cautionary tale. But that's exactly what they were, not by choice, not by some moral failing, but by circumstance, by isolation, by 100 small decisions that accumulated into a biological trap with no exit. And the most haunting part, they had tried to warn people. In the 1930s, one of the family members, a man named Illy, traveled to the county seat and tried to speak with a doctor about what was happening. He brought a list, names of children who had died, descriptions of the deformities, and he asked, point blank, if this was because of the marriages. The doctor, according to Illy's own account given years later, told him that mountain families were prone to weakness, that it was probably the water, or the diet, or the lack of sunlight in the deep valleys. He never mentioned genetics. He never mentioned inbreeding. He sent Illy home with a bottle of tonic and a suggestion to pray harder. That was the system failing, not the family. The family was already trapped, already circling the drain, but the outside world, the world that had laws and science and the ability to intervene, chose to look away, chose to let the mountains keep their secrets. And by the time anyone with the authority to do something finally paid attention, it was too late. The damage was generational, permanent, written into the DNA of children who never asked to be born into a loop with no beginning and no end. And the question isn't why did this family do this to themselves? The question is why did everyone else let them? Today, the valley where this family lived is mostly empty. A few structures remain, collapsed cabins, stone foundations disappearing into kudzu. The cemetery is still there, overgrown but maintained by a historical society that doesn't put up signs explaining what happened. If you visit, and most people don't, you'll find those gravestones. The ones with two names, the ones that list relationships that don't make sense until you understand what you're looking at. Wife and granddaughter, husband and nephew, mother and cousin, they're not errors. They're confessions carved into stone, permanent records of a family that became something families were never meant to become. There are descendants, not direct. The main line ended with Sarah in 1974. But there were members who left, who married outside, who tried to dilute what had been concentrated for so long. Some of them know their history, most don't. And the ones who do, the ones who have traced their lineage back and found themselves staring at a family tree that loops and twists and folds back on itself like a knot that can't be untied. They don't talk about it. Not publicly, not even privately in most cases, because what do you say? How do you explain that your great-great-grandmother was also your great-great-aunt, that your bloodline contains the same ancestor in 8 different positions? That the reason you exist is because people who shouldn't have had children together did, repeatedly, for 5 generations. The academic term for what this family experienced is called a founder effect, taken to its extreme conclusion. When a small population reproduces in isolation, certain traits become fixed. But this wasn't just a small population. This was a population that was actively shrinking its own gene pool with every marriage, creating artificial bottlenecks, and the result wasn't evolution, it was devolution, a genetic regression toward fragility, toward unsustainability, toward extinction. They didn't just bend the rules of heredity. They broke them, and what broke in return was everything: health, sanity, the basic ability to continue. But here's what stays with you, long after you've closed the archives and left the cemetery and tried to forget what you learned. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't ignorance. It was a choice, made over and over, by people who knew enough to know better but not enough to know how to stop. And that choice was enabled by a society that found it easier to ignore than to intervene. That found it simpler to let certain people disappear into certain places and pretend they were choosing their fate. This family didn't just twist their own tree. They were twisted by isolation, by poverty, by a system that never cared enough to offer them an alternative until it was far too late to matter. The gravestone with 2 names is still there. You can visit it if you want. Stand in front of it. Read the dates. Try to make sense of how one woman could be listed as both wife and granddaughter to the same man. And when you can't make sense of it, when the logic fails and the lines don't connect, and you're left standing in an overgrown cemetery in eastern Kentucky, staring at proof of something that shouldn't be possible, you'll understand what this family understood. That some loops, once they're started, can't be broken from the inside. They can only be waited out, generation by generation, birth by birth, until the last name is carved into the last stone and the loop finally, mercifully, ends.